In today's lesson, we're going to talk about measuring inequality. This is part of the OCR A-Level Geography Spec 3.A, where we need to look at different indices to be able to look at inequalities between a number of factors. Those factors that we're going to look at include income, housing, education, healthcare, and employment. So I'm going to start with income, and a really important indice for looking at absolute poverty is this benchmark that the World Bank set. They say that anybody that's earning less than $2 a day is considered to be in extreme poverty, what we call absolute poverty. So the indices about extreme poverty show me that generally over time, the numbers of people in absolute poverty have rapidly declined. So from the 60s, I can see there's been a huge drop from 60% of the world population being extreme poverty to closer to 10%. However, we need to, as geographers, think about this on a spatial scale. So when I look at this map, I can see that the indice of inequality shows me that in North and South America and Europe, there are relatively low levels of the population living in extreme poverty, below 5%. But if I look at Africa, there is significantly higher levels. So scale and looking at the kind of global pattern is important. But then I also need to look closer than that and look at a continental level and start to look at the differences within a continent. So I can see even within an area of much higher extreme poverty, there is a huge difference between the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has close to 70% in extreme poverty, compared to South Africa, which has less than 20%. Even going further, again, scale is really important. If I look at South Africa, this country that's one of the best in Southern Africa in terms of extreme poverty, there's huge regional differences. Cape Town in the southwest has less than 2% of the population in extreme poverty, while places in the east have much higher rates, closer to 30%. Not only about looking at these indices in terms of spatial differences, it's important to see that things can change with poverty levels over time. So the general trend is that poverty levels globally have gone down, but an event like COVID can change that. So we can see change over time, and the predictions are that COVID pandemic will actually cause an increase in the global amount of people living in absolute poverty, where it's relatively low of 7%, but it will go up in the next couple of years to nearly 9%. Another thing to look at in terms of income indices is relative poverty. So in the UK, what I would do to work that out is rank all of the households in terms of income. I'd take the middle one, and then I'd go 60% below that middle income, that median household income, and anybody that's in that would be relatively poor compared to the rest of the country. So that accounts for 14 million people in the UK. And we can see how these rates change over time. The general pattern is from the 90s that all households have generally, the poverty rates have gone down, so 25 to 22%. But the important thing to look in indices like this is there is differences between groups. So pensioners have gone significantly down from close to 30% of being in poverty to close to 15%. But also we need to see that these patterns will change over time. So generally there's been decrease through the 90s, but there has been points where it's gone up. And if we look at from 2013 onwards, there's been a slight increase in some of those groups. So especially children in poverty and pensioners have actually gone up. This also applies to certain groups. Certain groups will feel these effects more than others. So if you're in a black household, you're 50% more likely to be in a household full of poverty, whereas you're in a white household, you're only 20% likely to be in poverty. So age, gender, and ethnicity are really important things to look at in terms of these indices to see how the patterns differ. Last thing to consider really in income is the Genie Index. This is where how equally income is distributed across the population. I can see that the Canadian income is much closer between the rich and poor than Mexico. And again, I can look at that at a national, global level, but I can also use these indices to be looked at a regional level. So I can see that there is a gap between the north of the USA, where there is lower income inequality, and the southern states where there is higher income equality. So another factor to look at in terms of indices is housing, and specifically I'm interested in housing tenure. This tells me the relationship that someone has with their accommodation. What that means is, do they own the property? Do they rent it privately or rent it from government? So I can see from this graph of the UK's housing tenure that nearly 70 to 60% of people own their own property. That tells me that the UK is quite a wealthy country because they have enough disposable capital to be able to own their own property. But also I can see that renting privately is going up, which also tells me perhaps that the housing prices are going up, and therefore it's more expensive to own a property, and therefore we can see maybe an inequality creeping in there. Also, what's interesting here is the idea of socially renting. So this is where people rent from the government, and we can suggest that if you're having to rent from the government, therefore you don't have as much disposable capital, and therefore you're more likely to be in poverty. And we can see that the people that socially rent here are 40 to 50% more likely to have higher rates of poverty than those people who own their own homes. We also need to talk about LIDCs and how the housing tenure there is quite complex. The most common site we could look at is to see the fact is there's lots of informal settlements, squatter settlements, which are settlements not built on land that they don't own. We could say if there was a high proportion of these, that there is high inequality, but it's slightly more complex than that, because sometimes the houses in slums are actually houses that people rent from landlords. So we can see that there is some of these indices that are hard to kind of break down when we look at it in terms of LIDC context. In terms of looking at healthcare, we could look at indices on a global level like number of doctors per thousand, which shows me that Germany here 4.3 per thousand compared to India's 0.8 has much higher levels of development and potentially less inequality at a national level. But also I need to look beyond the national level because there's a really clear link between healthcare and unequal access that can cause kind of big social inequalities. And here's a map of the UK in terms of life expectancy. It shows me that the darker areas are generally in the north and industrial areas like South Wales. And that could be largely attributed to inequalities in healthcare provision in the UK. So they often talk about the NHS postcode lottery, which basically says that certain areas may have better provision than others. And so looking at kind of life expectancies per area might kind of help show us those patterns. I can also look at kind of wider kind of indices. So I could look at diet, perhaps, look at the kind of average calories consumed in a country level. But I could also look at kind of external factors. So here's some examples of air pollution. The physical environment would have an impact on kind of inequalities. And on the right here, I've shown actually how pollution's changed during COVID. It's been rapidly reduced by the fact that all the industries shut down. So again, that's talking about how inequalities which are there could change over time depending on events. When looking at education, we would look primarily at what's happening in formal education for indices. So what's happening in schools and universities and colleges. At a global level, we'd look at kind of literacy rates and compare general levels of education between countries. But when we're looking at a national level, we would look at something like the percentage of students in the UK who get 5 grades between A star and C at GCSE, or the amount of students getting an A and A star above, as we see in this graph at A level. One thing we need to consider here is inequalities might differ between countries and also regions, but also they can happen between genders. So looking at the amount of children that are out of school, so don't have access to education, I can see in Africa, Sub-Saharan and also North Africa and Asia that there are fewer women that are going to school. So there is a gender gap here in terms of access to education that we would need to consider when looking at indices like education. The last really category to consider is employment, and we could look most obviously at employment and unemployment rates, but also we would look at differences in wages. So you might have a country that's got a high employment rate, but differences rapidly between wages. I've got a map of the UK here, which has weekly earnings. The darker areas are the higher earnings and the lighter areas are the lower earnings. And we can see that the southeast has a lot of those darker areas, so much higher weekly earnings. But we can also see that there is a difference here between rural and urban areas. So North Wales and Cornwall are rural areas and they have lighter areas, therefore much lower earnings in those areas. So we can see that there's inequalities in wages, even if there isn't huge employment differences in these areas. One thing that's hard to kind of categorize in, especially in emerging and developing countries, is there is a lot of informal employment, so not regulated by the government, and therefore it's hard to sometimes quantify how much they can contribute to an economy, but also there is going to be a huge difference between the conditions and experiences of people in informal employment compared to those working in informal employment. And we can see places like India, which has really high informal employment, would obviously therefore have much different inequalities within it because of that. Last thing to really consider is to look at the fact we can look at composite measures of inequality, where we get several indices and put them together to get a general picture of inequality. And the Human Development Index is that. It looks at health, education, and wealth, life expectancy, average number of years of schooling, and GDP or GNI per capita. This is a really good way of looking at inequality because it's looking at different measures. So it's looking at kind of the social, economic, and physical side of inequalities, and therefore gives us a slightly broader picture of what's going on. And it can be compared globally between countries. It can also be between regions and areas in a country.